We can make spontaneous redox reactions do work for us. In other words, we can use them to build batteries. We've looked at this reaction several times. The oxidation of zinc metal by copper 2 plus to form zinc ion and copper metal. That is a spontaneous reaction. It has a positive overall E0 value and a negative delta G. You can actually quite simply make this reaction happen by taking some zinc metal, a strip of zinc metal, and just putting it in a beaker that contains copper ion. And what will happen is that there's an electron transfer from the zinc metal to the copper, and copper ion is then reduced to copper metal, which starts plating out on the surface of the zinc electrode, and consequently zinc ions are formed that go into solution. The copper 2 ions in the solution are typically supplied by copper sulfate. You could also use copper nitrate. The anion here is just a spectator in the reaction. Well, what would happen if we tried to separate the zinc metal from the copper 2 plus and made the electron transfer occur over a wire? Well, that, remember, spontaneous electron transfer might then be used to do some work, like light a light bulb or power a device. What would this look like? In the lab, you could make this happen by grabbing two beakers, and in one beaker you could put a 1 molar solution of zinc sulfate, so there'd be zinc ions in this solution, and in the other beaker 1 molar solution of copper sulfate, so there'd be copper 2 plus ions in this beaker. Put a strip of zinc metal in the zinc sulfate solution and a strip of copper metal in the copper sulfate solution, and then connect these two electrodes by a wire. This little black box here ultimately will be a voltmeter that we can measure the voltage. So in the beaker with the zinc sulfate and the zinc metal electrode, oxidation will occur. Well, how do we know that? Because we know zinc metal is oxidized by copper 2 plus. So zinc metal will form zinc ions plus 2 electrons, and the 2 electrons will leave the electrode and come over to the copper electrode, and at the copper electrode in solution, the 2 electrons will reduce a copper ion in solution to copper metal. So we have at what we call the cathode, the reduction half reaction, and at what we call the anode, the oxidation half reaction. We call this whole arrangement a Voltaic cell, and it consists of 2 half cells. One half cell is where oxidation occurs, that's the anode, and the other half cell is where reduction occurs, and that's the cathode. We'll run into a little problem here almost instantaneously, and that is current will flow, electrons will flow for a split second, but then they'll stop, basically because we don't have a complete circuit. So how can we fix this? We can fix this by not just reconnecting a wire back to the zinc electrode, but more appropriately, we can insert what we call a salt bridge. Let's think about what's going on in here. When the reaction starts, electrons start flowing from the zinc half cell to the copper half cell, and almost immediately you have a buildup of positive charge in this beaker, which would inhibit the electrons from leaving, and you have a buildup of negative charge in this beaker, which would deter electrons from arriving. So a goal here would be to keep each beaker charge neutral. We can do that by connecting the two beakers with what we call a salt bridge. And this salt bridge is typically a salt like sodium nitrate. And at either end of the salt bridge, we have a semi-permeable membrane. And this is often what's called fritted glass. And what it does is it allows the flow of ions and not the direct mixing of the solutions. Over time, the solutions will start mixing. But at least at the beginning here, we have ion flow without direct solution mixing. Sodium ions in the salt bridge will migrate toward the cathode. Well, what's the purpose of doing that? Well, remember, when electron transfer starts occurring, we get a buildup of negative charge in the cathode, which would inhibit more electrons from coming over. If sodium ions are flowing into this beaker, it would, in a sense, neutralize the effect of these negative charges coming in, and it would keep this beaker charge neutral. Also, nitrate ions would flow in the opposite direction. So the nitrate ions would flow toward the beaker that have electrons leaving them. That prevents a buildup of positive charge in this beaker when these nitrate ions start flowing in. Now, the other thing that's going on here that you have to keep in mind is that as zinc is being oxidized and forming zinc ions in the anode, this zinc electrode is losing mass. And at the same time, when electrons come over here and reduce copper ions to copper metal that played out on the copper electrode is gaining mass. Again, overall charge flow is really important in a battery. So we want to think of not only electrons flowing through the wire and lighting the light bulb, but also mobile charges inside the battery, which keep the cathode and the anode charge neutral. We can look at a more professionally produced diagram of this zinc copper ion voltaic cell. This is from the Brown Chemistry Central Science textbook. We can see in this cartoon, again, the anode is on the left, where zinc is oxidized to zinc ion, and electrons leave this electrode and go over to the cathode. There's a nice cartoon here showing the individual zinc metal ions being oxidized, each one losing 2 electrons, and then the zinc metal ion forming zinc 2 ion and going into solution. In the cathode, the opposite occurs, meaning reduction occurs. So here we have electrons coming into the electrode and individual copper ions being reduced and forming copper metal atoms that start building up on the copper electrode. Some things to note here: oxidation always occurs at the anode, reduction always occurs at the cathode. In a voltaic cell, the anode is the negative electrode and the cathode is a positive electrode. This makes sense because you've got electrons. You could think of electrons as leaving the negative electrode and seeking the positive electrode. This salt bridge here looks a little different. This one is probably more closely identified with the kind that I would use in a lecture demonstration. I would stuff a little cotton on either side of this glass tube that I had filled with a saturated solution of sodium nitrate. Again, the salt bridge purpose is to allow ion migration to keep both half cells charge neutral as the electrons are flowing from the spontaneous redox reaction. Sodium ions would be flowing toward the cathode, nitrate ions and negative ions toward the anode. And here we have a voltmeter that's measuring the voltage for this, which turns out to be, in ideal conditions, 1.1 volts. The voltmeter can measure the voltage in a way that doesn't really perturb the system very much. And we showed or demonstrated in lecture 3, in fact on slide 5, how we could calculate the overall voltage of 1.1 volts for this reaction. An alternative to that method shown on slide 5 of lecture 3 is to use this equation, and that is the overall E cell is the reduction potential for the cathode reaction minus the reduction potential for the anode reaction. This seems a little counterintuitive because we've stressed that oxidation occurs at the anode, so let's keep going here and see how this can make sense. What I've done is taken the E0 value off the table of standard reduction potentials for the reduction of copper ion to copper and written that right here. So in other words, here's the E0 value, E0 of reduction for the reaction occurring at the cathode. It's plus 0.34 volts. I've then subtracted the E0 reduction value for the zinc 2+ zinc system, but instead of writing the zinc 2+ zinc half reaction as an oxidation, which we should, but what I'm going to do is just read it directly off the table as a reduction and put it right here, minus 0.76 volts. So that's what I mean by taking the value off the table for the copper 2+ copper system and subtracting the value right off the table for the zinc 2+ zinc system, not worrying about the fact that zinc's actually being oxidized rather than being reduced. So I read it right off the table. When you do the subtraction, you get 1.1 volts. So you can get this value here by just reading the values for the half reactions right off the table of standard reduction potentials. Well, here's what a real voltaic cell setup might look like. What we have here again is a beaker with zinc ion. It's the anode. It's where zinc's oxidized to zinc 2+. The zinc electrode is right here. This would be a 1 molar solution of zinc sulfate. Well, where do the electrons go? Well, when they leave this electrode, they go through the wire into the voltmeter, back out the voltmeter to the copper electrode that's immersed in copper sulfate. And of course, at the cathode, we have copper ions being reduced to copper metal. Here, the salt bridge is a little bit different. In a sense here, there's no salt bridge. What we have here is a glass tube connecting the two beakers. This glass tube here would be solid glass. This would be to just keep the beakers together. And what we have here is a fritted glass semi-permeable membrane that's just separating the cathode solution from the anode solution. This would allow ions to flow in the correct direction. And since we're not filling this with, say, sodium nitrate, what we'd have here is zinc ions that are in this solution flowing toward the cathode, and sulfate ions, which are in this solution, flowing toward the anode. This cell would work fine until the solutions over time would start mixing a little bit. You'd start to see a little bit of blue in this beaker, but it makes a great demo. Let's try another example. Suppose you were given this picture here, and you were asked to calculate the overall E cell for what you're being told is a voltaic cell, meaning it's going to have a positive overall E cell. And you're asked to use the indicated half reactions and the table of standard reduction potentials, which, by the way, is located on the next slide, but I reproduced the important part of it right here. Let's take a look at the diagram. How do we know that these are the half reactions that are occurring in these beakers? Let's look at the beaker on the left. It says we have a 1 molar solution of iron 2 plus, doesn't say what the anion is, and that electrons are flowing from the iron electrode over to this platinum electrode. Why platinum? We'll talk about that in a second. So oxidation is occurring in this beaker. Iron 2 plus, iron, so the oxidation must be iron atoms being oxidized to iron 2 plus, and then the electrons leaving and going over to the cathode compartment. Well, what would be the reaction in the cathode compartment? This looks a little complicated. We have a solution that's 1 molar in permanganate, manganese 2 plus, and hydrogen ion. And you have manganese in 2 different forms. If electrons are coming over here, they're probably going to reduce the manganese with the highest oxidation number. I don't have it marked here, but manganese in permanganate has a +7 oxidation state. So surely the electrons are going to go after the permanganate. Hydrogen ions are needed for this reaction, and the product would be manganese 2 plus water. So in this half reaction, this reduction half reaction, we haven't used anything that's not in this beaker. The other way we'd know that this was the half reaction is if we looked at the available half reactions on the table of standard reduction potentials. And here's one that involves all the components that are in this beaker. Well, again, the E0 reduction value for iron 2 plus in iron, or in other words, iron's being oxidized here, but the E0 reduction for iron 2 plus being reduced to iron is on this table. So we have the iron 2 plus system. The E0 reduction for this exact reduction shown here is on the table. There is another reaction on this table of standard reduction potentials involving permanganate, but it doesn't match the half reaction that we would need here. We'll see that when we look at the table. So before we get too confused, let's look at our equation for calculating E cell. We'd have what's going on in the cathode, 1.51 volts, minus what's going on in the anode, which is an iron 2 plus iron system, or iron 2 plus system. But remember, even though iron's being oxidized here, we're going to use the reduction potential for the iron 2 plus iron system right off the table. 1.51 minus a minus 0.44 gives us an overall E cell of 1.95 volts. Very spontaneous. No wonder electrons are flowing here spontaneously from the iron to the electrode in the cathode half cell. You might ask, what's platinum doing here? Notice that this half reaction has no solid metals involved. So what we need is a conduit for electrons. Platinum is great in this regard because it's inert, meaning it's very unreactive. It's not going to get oxidized very easily or undergo any other sort of reactions very easily. So platinum is very handy to use in electrochemical cells. The only drawback, of course, is that it is incredibly expensive. Well, here's the larger table of standard reduction potentials. And just to recall, this was a value minus 0.44 we used for the iron 2+ iron system for the anode. This was the value we used for the cathode. And as I told you, there was another reaction involving permanganate, but it did not involve manganese 2+, and in fact involved manganese dioxide solid and hydroxide ions. So this is not a good match for what was happening in that beaker. That's why we use this value and not this value. In part 2 of this lecture, we'll talk a little bit about what's called the standard hydrogen electrode, which is related to the fact that, as we've mentioned before, this reduction involving hydrogen ion to hydrogen is defined as 0 volts, and it is the basis for the rest of the values in this table.